Welcome back to Just Liberty, friends. I am your host, Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, and here with my co-host, friend, and colleague, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, celebrating 120 years. Imagine that. It's just a fantastic magazine, and we're happy to do a podcast branded around the Liberty name called Just Liberty. So today's interview is one I've been looking forward to trying to round up a guest all year long. Early, we heard the rhetoric about the new administration being so pro-religion, and yet the first thing that they did was cut off funding for faith-based organizations that are making a huge difference globally in saving lives, cutting off funds, shutting down U.S. aid. So, Bettina, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Today, we're delighted to welcome Matthew Soerens to the podcast. Matthew is a vice president of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, which is the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. And so he spends a lot of time at this intersection between faith, policy, and real world impact. And that's what we're going to be talking with him about today. He's also the co-author of a number of books, including an intriguing title, Inalienable, which looks at how voices on the margins of society can help reshape and strengthen the American church. I think that's going to be our part 2 discussion for another day, Matthew. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, wonderful to be with you both.
One of the early policies of the current administration really impacted faith-based aid work, right, around the world. It was to eliminate U.S. aid. Talk to us about the kinds of work that impacted, the kinds of work that World Relief does, that other faith-based relief and development organizations do, that were, really aided in a significant way by USA.
Yeah, I so appreciate that question, Alan. World Relief is, as you said, we're the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, and we're a global Christian humanitarian organization. Works, with lots of peers that are other faith-based organizations in similar spaces, including Adventist organizations. And we've been around for a long time on the mission of boldly engaging the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church. So that's one of the crises that we spend a lot of time on right now, is one of displacement, when people are forced to flee their homes, sometimes flee their countries because of persecution or conflict. It's some of the factors up ahead of that displacement that sometimes contribute to it as well. Situations of hunger, of access to clean water and sanitation, access to basic health infrastructure. And so we've been doing that work around the world for many years. And actually, most of the work that we do around the world is not governmentally funded. A year ago at this time, we were operating in 11 countries outside of the United States, and only in 4 of those countries did we have funding from USAID. So it's not the case that we are, primarily contractors of the United States government, but we do partner with the federal government, and unabashedly so. I'm old enough to remember 20 years ago when Christian organizations were making the case, I think appropriately, that if the federal government sees it as in the interest of the American people to, provide support for people living in poverty or facing displacement or conflict, and there are faith-based organizations that are doing that as well or better than non-faith-based organizations, then faith-based organizations should be able to basically compete on an equal playing field. Not that we should be given a grant because we're Christians or some other religious tradition, but because out of the motivation of our Christian faith, we do really good work. And that is, I think, the case for the work that World Relief does. Again, I know we partner with other faith-based humanitarian organizations that do excellent work as well. Specifically, 1 year ago, or just about a year ago now, within a few days of inauguration for the second Trump administration, we received this rather abrupt notice that we should stop work on all USAID funded projects. And actually, The State Department funded U.S. refugee resettlement process as well, which we can talk about separately. But the same executive order impacted a lot of the work that World Relief does, both in the United States and internationally. And I will say that came as a surprise to us. We worked very closely with USAID in the first Trump administration and actually found them to be very friendly to faith-based organizations. That was sort of the reputation of USAID during the first Trump administrations. We had some issues with the Biden administration where they were, we had a good partnership in many ways, but also there were moments when there were questions on how comfortable they were with faith-based organizations with faith-based hiring statements like World Relief has. So we didn't necessarily anticipate this being a challenging shift from one administration to another. And then it became extremely challenging very abruptly because a significant part of our programs in a few particular countries facing very acute humanitarian crises. For us, it was the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, and Haiti. We were being told we couldn't use any of the federal funding that had been committed to us in those countries. And we have a little bit of privately funded operation there, of course, as well, but not enough to sustain most of our programming. And also there are dynamics, for example, in Haiti, we had some seeds that were actually contributed by the US government. We don't technically own those. So we couldn't, it was unclear what we could do with those seeds, but they needed to go under the ground at a certain time period in a country facing a very stark humanitarian crisis. Similarly, like all sorts of health dynamics where, we're a primary healthcare provider in a place like the Bentu internally displaced person camp in South Sudan, where children under the age of 5 facing malnutrition are coming to us for life-saving treatments. And we were suddenly facing the incredibly difficult decision of, if we have this much funding left over from our church partners, from private donors, do we just provide life-saving assistance to the kids under 2 and let the 3 to 5-year-olds go? Do incredibly heartbreaking decisions. And I will say, we saw churches and individuals step up with private donations in really beautiful ways, not enough to compensate for the federal funding that had been lost so abruptly. And I think the harsh reality is that there were lives that were lost, and most of that funding, some of it has come back, but most of it is not. And so this USAID has been eliminated completely. Some of the funding has moved over to the US State Department, but the overall funding for US foreign assistance is a fairly small fraction of what it was 1 year ago.
I mean, what was it like in leadership as you were trying to make these sort of decisions on the fly without a real clear roadmap of where this was going to end up? I mean, it must have been pretty fraught.
It was a very stressful several weeks and into several months. A time that really brought our executive leadership team to prayer on a regular basis, both because that should be guiding us, but also because we have we don't know what to do with very unforeseen circumstances, incredibly difficult decisions. And again, for us, it was hitting us internationally and concurrently affecting a lot of the work that we do in the United States with refugees as well. And we did see God provide in some beautiful ways. I think we saw opportunities for us to speak into what was happening. We're not here as Republicans or Democrats. We're a nonpartisan organization, but we want to be able to tell the truth about the impact of some of these policy changes and do so in respectful ways. We certainly affirm President Trump has the authority and even the responsibility to ensure that USAID funds are spent appropriately in the ways that they were intended by the Congress when they were appropriated. But we also saw the real effects on human beings in the image of God. I think, had we been given a year-long notice, like these funds are going to be depleted over time, we might be disappointed, but we would at least have been able to have planned. But it was also abrupt that it was particularly harmful.
So Lancet, renowned medical journal, predicted that the end of U.S. aid could lead to as many as 14 million preventable deaths over the next couple of decades. Is that, from your perspective, is that hyperbole? Is there a sound evidentiary basis for that? Is it overstated? How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a researcher who can affirm all the different methodological questions there, but I would say on at least an anecdotal level, the reality is there is far less funding covering basic medical treatments and inputs like nutrition than there was a year ago. The US has historically led the way in foreign assistance, and other countries have often followed our lead. And there was maybe some hope other countries will step up in our absence, and generally that does not happen. Generally, they follow our lead, whether that's in a generous way or in a, a less generous way. And I also, it's probably a mistake to frame this just as generosity, because I genuinely believe that a lot of foreign assistance, I'm not defending everything spent on foreign assistance under the Biden administration or the Obama administration for that matter. But a lot of U.S. foreign assistance, I think, was deeply in the interests of the United States people. I mean, the
Well,
United States has a great reputation in certain parts of Africa, largely because of the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that has saved 26 million lives since President Bush launched it back in 2003, I believe. That relatively small investment of U.S. resources that has saved so many lives and prevented a generation. I mean, we were in a situation where you had a generation of orphans. Their parents were all dying. And World Relief was operating in many of the countries affected in that time period. I have colleagues who can speak with, they get choked up just talking about, like, our work was a lot of supporting people through funerals and then trying to figure out who's going to raise children who've lost their both parents to this horrific infection and disease. That actually, there are medications that cost very little that can basically, bring you back to life effectively. And I will say we've seen Christians speak up for some of that funding for the PEPFAR program in particular. Last summer, there was an effort to withdraw some of those funds, a lot of those funds. And I know we had people at World Relief who were calling their members of Congress. There was Christian musicians making phone calls to members of Congress. And eventually the Senate pushed back on that, bipartisan pushback, and a lot of those funds were saved, which I think means lives will be saved. Because to your first question, Alan, I can't independently verify Lancet's specific number, but it unfortunately seems credible to me that we could be talking about that scale of loss of human life when you look at the various life-saving interventions that have been minimized or ended altogether.
Well, okay. So do we have data from the first year where approximately, at least we're ending the first year of this administration? What data do we have about deaths that would otherwise have been prevented? Do we have that data for 2025?
I think the hard reality is part of the USAID infrastructure that was eliminated would have been able to count those things. And that's not there. There's not the same visibility in some cases. So sometimes the best we could guess is some of the sort of analysis that the researchers with Lancet have done. I can say from World Relief's experience on the ground, people have said nobody has died because of this. That's not true. I cannot tell you how many have died, but I know that it's not true that it's none. And I think as Christians who believe that God has made every single human being in his image with inherent dignity and worth, that should grieve us when it is a preventable death, a death from a disease that we know how to prevent, that God has given us the ingenuity to learn how to prevent. Sometimes it's as simple as you need a certain minimal number of calories to sustain life, and not everyone in this world tragically has that. And again, I'm not saying that's entirely the government's role. I think the church has an important role, and all sorts of churches are involved in providing food for the hungry in obedience to Jesus's, words in Matthew chapter 25, and following Jesus's example in feeding the 5,000. And there's so many biblical reasons to be concerned. You can go back to the Old Testament, to Isaiah 58. Churches have been about that work for a long time, but it's also in the interest of our government and the interest of a government that I think has been very influenced by Christian values to want to provide assistance to people facing those situations. And again, out of humanitarian concern, out of compassion from a Christian perspective, but also from like a smart diplomatic political perspective. Like if we want influence in the world, one way to do that is by being the strongest. And we basically are that, but there's limits to how much you can do by being the strongest and having the most military power. There's also a soft power that comes from earning credibility with nations around the world and with the people within them. And America's never been perfect, but we have at various points in our history, I think often motivated by the Christian faith of a lot of the people of this country, demonstrated a concern for the basic dignity of human beings that has been a positive influence in the world. And if we step back from that, it's hard to predict what the negative consequences of that could be medium to long term. The short term consequences are people dying from preventable diseases, from hunger, from lack of access to clean water.
So, Matthew, the narrative that has grown up around the end of USAID has been that this was a program that was administered in a very inefficient way, that it had been diverted toward inappropriate uses, that had become somewhat politicized. That's kind of the narrative that many accept for why this program was ended. What basis did that have in reality, if any?
I mean, my assessment of that would be, I'm sure if my job was to go through the USAID budget from 2024, which would be a tremendous job because it was a large agency, I would find things that I personally either disagreed with or just thought were not efficient uses of taxpayer funds. But I think the overall effect of USAID, in my mind, there's no question, was that it was largely exactly the sort of humanitarian and development programs that are what Congress created it to be, and which I think are very much in the interest of the U.S., of the American people, along with, of course, very much in the interest of vulnerable neighbors around the world. And to the extent that there were programs that weren't efficient, that's the prerogative of an administration to come in and end. But instead of, I mean, it's sort of the analogy of, instead of removing, surgically a small bit of cancer, we just killed the patient. And that's not, I think, what we should have done. And to be fair, there are some of USAID's functions have been taken over by the State Department. So maybe it's unfair to say we killed the patient, but it was a total shutdown for a significant period of time. And what has sort of been revived has been limited in scope, even though some of what's been revived is very positive and we're thankful for it.
Well, the metaphor that was going through my mind was throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. The Article 2 of our Constitution gives the president the obligation to faithfully execute the laws and policies enacted by Congress. And so that would include audit and oversight and holding various funding programs accountable, and having oversight. But to do that, you don't just throw everything out, and then start over without counting the cost.
Yeah,
and the cost has been in human lives here.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, obviously, I'm somewhat critical of the administration's actions here. I think Congress also needs to take some responsibility because they are part of that equation you just outlined, Alan. They're appropriating the funds. They also have an oversight function, and they should have an opinion when the funds that they've appropriated are just not used for the purposes that they've been appropriated. Now, there's any number of things where I think Congress might be spending more money than it's appropriate or less money than it's appropriate, but the process to change that is really Congress's prerogative. And then the president and the administration, of course, do have a responsibility to faithfully execute, the funding and the programming that Congress has established. But it does feel like we're in a moment when it's sort of a much more authoritative administrative situation, and Congress doesn't, with limited exceptions. Again, I'm really thankful Senator Collins and some of her counterparts on the other side of the aisle were really helpful in saving some of the funding for our program last summer. And I really appreciate that. And so there have been some real clear cases of congressional leadership, but overall, I haven't been particularly impressed with Congress on a bipartisan basis stepping in to lead on these issues.
So let's switch gears for a moment. What about refugees? Because that is another area, a policy area that the Trump administration has certainly made some pretty significant changes to. Can you talk us through what those changes are and who have been impacted the most by those?
Yeah, so I think it is first important to start with definitions, because sometimes refugees get sort of lost in the broader conversations around immigration policy. Under U.S. law, the Refugee Act of 1980, so this is not a new law, refugees are a subset of all immigrants who are specifically defined as having fled a well-founded fear of persecution, on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or particular social group. And under the US system, obviously there are tens of millions of refugees in our world today, unfortunately, far more than there was when I started at World Relief 20 years ago. But of about 40 million refugees globally, in 2024, for example, the US said they would take up to 125,000. So a very small fraction of the world's refugees. But those individuals are vetted overseas by the US State Department and then the Department of Homeland Security to vet, both to make sure they meet the definition of a refugee, but also that they're not a public safety or public health threat in any way. By the way, this includes a lot of Christians persecuted for their faith. In 2024, there was 125,000 max. It was actually about 100,000 who came in under that ceiling. And of those, just about 30,000 were Christian refugees from the 50 countries where Open Doors US says that Christians face the most severe persecution. So a lot of the folks talking about the persecution they fled is actually on account of their religion, and often that is Christianity of one denomination or another. So that's how the program worked. People were vetted overseas. They fly on airplanes. They actually, our government arranges travel for them. They have to pay back their plane ticket. So it's not actually that, there are some commitments that the refugees make as well, but like, this is not unlawful in any way. This is a legal immigration process. World Relief's role, along with some other organizations, mostly faith-based, is to pick people up once they arrive at the airport, make sure that they have housing set up, get them into jobs, get kids into school. And we do that in really close collaboration with local churches around the country. So we've been doing that since the 70s. What we basically saw happen in January of 2025 was that the entire refugee resettlement program was suspended on day one of the new administration, which again, we actually did anticipate that because it happened in 2017 and the president said during the campaign he would do that. We respectfully disagreed with that, but we were prepared for it. What frankly we weren't prepared for was a few days later, as part of this ban on foreign assistance, and honestly, we'd never conceptualized refugee resettlement as foreign assistance, but as part of the executive order on foreign assistance, we were told we also could not spend any of the State Department's funding that had been appropriated for refugee resettlement, which is basically funding that covers housing for the first 90 days that a refugee family is in the country. So that was a huge shock to us. And again, we turned to our church partners, to individual donors, and they stepped up in really beautiful ways. It was one of the more, in the midst of a really hard season, also really a gratifying experience to see God's people step up. And we didn't have any refugees go homeless, thank God, which doesn't mean it was painless because we lost a lot of staff. We frankly prioritized paying for rent rather than sustaining some of our staffing. And then the refugee program going forward remained suspended. So that affected refugees who've been resettled in the 90 days prior to the new administration coming in. Going forward, it was suspended, and it remains largely suspended. The president just a few months ago set the ceiling for fiscal year 2026 at 7,500, which is historically low. Again, historical context here, it was 231,700 back in 1980. Like, we've had times when we did a lot more as a country. And there's a lot of evidence that it's been in our interest to do so. Those refugees receive more in taxpayer funds than they're paying in for the first few years in the country. But according to a study from some economists at Notre Dame, within a number of years, usually around year 8 or so, they are paying in more in taxes than they're receiving. And by 20 years after arrival, they're making a net contribution of about $21,000 a year more in taxes than they've received in governmental expenditures over those 20 years. So now it's down to a historic low, and actually the only group that's been prioritized under the current refugee ceiling are white Afrikaners from South Africa, who it's sort of debatable that whether they meet the definition of a refugee. The administration has said they face discrimination. I think it's actually notable that they're not using the language of the law, which is persecution. And what is really clear is that narrow focus excludes Iranian Christians who have fled persecution on account of their faith in Jesus. It excludes Burmese refugees, and that's actually been the top country of origin for refugees over the last 20 years, mostly Christians, in many cases persecuted for their faith. It includes people who fled the war in Ukraine or the war in Sudan or the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It includes people who have been peacefully resisting an authoritarian regime in Venezuela and face persecution as a result. So we're really concerned about the people who are left. I mean, we're less focused on should Afrikaners be allowed to come than on the people that a sole focus on that one ethnic group excludes from finding safety in the United States.
it's just such a troubling picture. I'm tempted just to leave it there. But
If I
is
could add one troubling dynamic, I mean, as we're recording this, Alan, just literally since last weekend, we've started to see lawfully resettled refugees who came in the last few years, in Minnesota in particular, be detained by the federal immigration authorities. Again, these are people who were invited by the U.S. government to come to this country, and the administration is saying we're not clear on how many people this is affecting. We're also not clear if this is going to go beyond Minnesota at this point, though that they have said they're starting this operation in Minnesota. But we have refugees who, to be really clear, have not committed any crimes, were lawfully admitted to this country after fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution in their countries of origin. There's been a lot of focus on Somalia because there are a lot of Somali refugees in Minnesota, but actually the clients that are resettled by our affiliate have not been from Somalia. They're from Latin America, they're from other parts of Africa, they're from Europe. And they've been picked up at their homes, moved to Texas. We're not quite sure what's happening. They may be reprocessing their cases, is what we guess. And other refugees who have heard this are hiding in their homes, literally not going to work, not going to school, not going to church, which is, it's a profoundly scary situation for them. And for the churches that have been helpful and have been a part of resettling them into that community in Minnesota, those communities in Minnesota. Whether this goes beyond Minnesota or not, we don't know at this time. But I do think, there's a lot of focus nationally on immigration enforcement. I think it's really important to be clear. These are not the worst of the worst. Many of these are persecuted Christians who were lawfully admitted to the United States through a very unambiguously legal process that's been around for decades, that are doing their best to build a new life in the United States, who've sort of exhaled in the last few years that they were finally safe, often after living in a refugee camp for years or even decades. And now they're experiencing dynamics that for many of them feel an awful lot like what they fled in the first place.
Matthew, you've shared a lot of information that is profoundly distressing, frankly. And I'm guessing that there's listeners who may be thinking, what on earth can be done about this? How can I help in alleviating some of these situations? Any advice?
Yeah, I do think, and again, I say this as a nonpartisan organization, because there's things that we affirm that the Trump administration has done as well in other policy areas. But I think the president and his administration need to hear, especially from Christian voters, that even when there's lots of areas of agreement, even perhaps on immigration policy, for example, I'm with a few nuance, I'm happy to see a more secure border. Of course, we want secure borders, but that has nothing to do with rounding up refugees who've come in through a lawful process, many of whom are persecuted for their faith. And I do think it's important that the administration hear that Christian voters actually have some nuanced views on these issues. We want order and security and respect for the rule of law, and we also want compassion and respect for religious liberty. And we value the contributions that immigrants have made to our country or the history of our country, but including to the church. The Adventist church in my neighborhood speaks Spanish. It's a very diverse Christian tradition. And that's true for a lot of Christian traditions in the United States that have been very much blessed by immigrant communities. So I think conveying that respectfully to our elected officials, I think also coming behind organizations like World Relief and others that are doing their best to keep the work going with a lot less resources for those who had part of their budget covered by the federal government in the past. That's true internationally with some of the formerly USAID funded programs. It's true in the US with programs serving refugees. The added dynamic in the US is we don't have the option to run this program without the government. We can't decide a refugee is going to come into the country. It's not a matter of if we just raise all the money privately. That sort of private sponsorship process actually did exist a year ago, and it has also been suspended. That was just a church pooling the money for a specific refugee family. That process, which used, of course, a lot fewer taxpayer dollars, has also been suspended at this point.
And I think it should be noted that problems with our refugee legal structure long predate this administration. Before I started doing this podcast with Bettina, I was doing a radio show for many, many years, and one of my favorite interviews resulted also from a meeting at the Christian Legal Society with Ken Starr, former Solicitor General, former lots of things, dean at Pepperdine, and my law partner had clerked for him as a Pepperdine student. But he had represented a refugee who was a Chinese Christian, and his case was up, I want to say, before the 10th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, having gone through the system. But Ken was able to negotiate a settlement of this gentleman's case because of his own political connections. But he freely confessed that the legal system for dealing with refugees was just hopelessly broken, and this would have been probably during the Obama administration, during a Democratic administration. So it's not, there are problems that go far beyond,
Absolutely.
one administration or another. And I think that's probably an important point.
Absolutely affirm that. I mean, I think people, a lot of people who, like me, their ancestors came here 150 years ago or more, have this idea of the U.S. immigration legal system that's probably about a century and a half old, where you show up at Ellis Island and show that you're a half decent person and they let you in and you work hard. The reality is that's not been our immigration system for, well, at least since the 1920s. And we had a very restrictive immigration policy in the United States for a few decades, so restrictive that when Jewish people showed up on boats, they were turned away in some cases,
right,
because there wasn't a slot for them in our immigration system. And that was part of how we ended up with the Refugee Act of 1980.
And there wasn't a desire to create a slot for them, even in the face of knowing what was happening in Germany.
That's right. And I think as Christians, we need to own that sometimes we knew, sometimes we didn't know, sometimes we didn't want to know, what was happening in Germany. By the end of World War II, there was more of a real recognition of like, wow, as a country, we shouldn't have done that. Like, the Holocaust was real. This is what actually happened to people, and we should have found a way to incorporate those people in. And to be fair, we didn't take. It's not that no one fled and found refuge. It's just that some people fled and were turned away. And because we didn't have a clear infrastructure, we had limited slots. And the effect of that, in part with U.S. leadership, was the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, basically establishing a process to say, when someone shows up and can demonstrate that they have a well-founded fear of persecution for one or more of these reasons, we're not going to send them back. And here's a process where when people are stuck overseas, and this came a little bit later with the Refugee Act, which codified the Refugee Convention of 1951. Here's a process to bring people over to the United States who have proven that they have that well-founded fear of persecution. Not all the people who have faced persecution. Again, in a high year like 2024, we were talking about 1/4% of the world's refugees. Now that we're at 7,500 out of 40 million, that's math beyond my ability, but it is a very, very, very small percent. And there is the concern that the people coming from South Africa, as lovely as they may be, and I'd be happy to welcome them, probably don't actually meet that formal legal definition of a well-founded fear of persecution for one of the reasons under the law.
So, Matthew, this has been a fascinating conversation, sobering as well. And we're going to take away a lot from what you've shared with us today. We're praying for you and your team as you negotiate the twists and turns that I'm sure are ahead. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Bettina. Thank you, Alan.
So, Alan, that I think was one of the more sobering discussions that we've had on this podcast. Would you agree?
I'm really, really upset, and it's just awful. I mean, yes, people are dying, and we Americans, we are like, we don't really know or care about anything that happens outside, beyond our borders, right? It's like, oh, okay, African people are dying. Well, they don't count.
Yeah. So that is a human tendency. I remember maybe 10 years ago visiting some refugee camps in Greece. And, there's a lot of refugee camps in Greece dealing with, or in different European countries, dealing with this sort of mass immigration from various parts of the world. But, you can talk about these things in terms of statistics, or you can look into the faces of some of these kids who are forced to go to school, to live, to sleep, to play, to grow up in an enclosed space that, Alan, you and I, we would look around in horror if we were told that we had to live in this small space. And these are human beings. These are men, women, children who are suffering because of policies that not only the United States, but also other European countries are making about the fate of refugees. It's such a complex topic, but it's also a profoundly moral topic. And we can't divorce the morality from the discussion.
No, we can't. And the thing that was unsaid, although hinted at, is that the better we make conditions in other countries, the less pressure there is for people to want to come, leave their home and come and flood our borders.
Right.
And it's like, there's the old saying in health uh, and wellness teaching that you put the guardrail on the cliff rather than the ambulance down in the valley. You don't clean up the mess after somebody's fallen over the cliff. uh, like you teach people how to have heart health, not how to fix heart attacks, right?
Right.
But here, we're trying to create the border security, but the real border security is functioning countries where people can live their lives. Nobody wants to leave home, really, do they? I don't
Right.
think so. I think they want to be home and have a safe home where home is, not somebody else's home. But the whole mess is tragic. It really is, and it, we're going to veer off into politics if we don't if we don't shut up pretty soon.
Let's not do that, Alan.
Let's
But
not.
let's remember that we all have a part to play in this. I mean, we can contact our representatives, we can support organisations, not only World Relief, but many other faith-based organisations that really are making a difference in this space, despite the challenges. So, listeners, that is it for our show today. We're glad you joined us, and please remember, get involved, get engaged, get informed, because the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.